Hello, Frank. Can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Great. Adam?
Yep.
All right, great. So I think we're good to go. I see we have 8 participants. Hello, Craig. I see Craig on there. Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay. And Anderson Lopez, thank you. I will be sure to share materials with you. We have a few folks here today who are not native English speakers, so I hope we come across clearly. All right, great. Well, I'm going to wait just another minute, and we're going to start this. You know, I don't really need to have my list of participants looking at us all. Thank you all for joining us today. This is a good opportunity. We've just had a beautiful rainstorm here in the Rocky Mountains, and there's a tiny bit of snow I can still see outside of my window on the high peaks, about 3 miles away from where I'm standing. So thank you for joining this short course in conversational sales intelligence, or how to get key information without asking questions. I'm going to go ahead and charge into this, and those who haven't been able to log in yet will be able to listen to the recording. So just a couple of things, if I may. I haven't muted anyone, so if you end up with a lot of background noise, you should have the ability to mute yourself. And if you would do that, I would appreciate it. So would everybody else. I'm sure whatever's happening where you are is probably more interesting, but if you don't mind. Also, I won't be able to see you very readily raise your hand. There's a setting I can use to do that, but it's a little hard for me to do that at the same time that I'm giving this webinar. So what I'd sort of like to do is ask you if you've got something to say, or if I ask a question and you'd like to say something, just speak up. There's not that many people. I think we have 24 people in attendance today, so that ought to be enough for us to handle. We've got about 45 minutes planned. If you need to drop off before we're done, fine. But if you don't stay to the end, you won't get the cookie. Okay. Someone just said you can't see how to mute. I should show you. Okay. Well, let me show you how to mute yourself then. Okay. You should have a little tool that looks a little bit like this. Do you see the top of my screen? If you go to the top of your screen, you should see something that has a little mute button on the left-hand side. I'm not going to mute mine, as that would defeat the purpose of the webinar. But there you go. Hopefully you've got something like that. If not, just try doing it locally on your computer. So there you go. Hopefully that solves the need. Okay, so who are we? This is who we are, really. We're a company that adapts national intelligence tools to drive growth for our clients. I'm not going to do a lot of selling here, but I have to at least introduce who we are and where we're coming from. We believe that companies do a good job for sharpening their competitive edge if they can learn what clients need and will buy faster than the other guy, outthink and outflank their competitors, and ethically apply the proven influence tools that have been shown to be effective in the world of national intelligence over the years to ethically sway people to align with their way of thinking and to make a decision that will benefit both parties. This can help you shorten the sales cycle by getting the information influence you need faster. And the nice thing about this is these techniques fit into every known sales system and process. They are, in fact, force multipliers. Now, in the military, and I come from the Army originally, military intelligence, yes, I know that's an oxymoron. A force multiplier is something that lets you punch above your strength. In other words, intelligence, knowing where to hit the enemy, is often just as important as having the firepower that you need to hit the enemy. We're not talking about enemies here, but prospects, and we certainly don't want to literally kill the competition, but the ability to understand what is needed, where, and in what strength you need to do what is essential to being able to win any sale, as I'm sure any experienced salesperson will tell you. By the way, I'm hearing a lot of background noise, so if there's anyone, I would suggest we make a slight adaptation. If you wish to say something, unmute. I would say that you should all start by muting, if you don't mind. So these are some of the clients. We have quite a roster of clients over the last, 17 years that we've been in business. These are just a few of them. We've worked with a lot of companies that make technical and engineered products. We've done a lot of work in the chemical and power industries, but also, as you can see, high technology, aviation. Basically, anybody who is in a position where they face fierce competition for a fairly significant reward if they overcome that competition. And what we do is we help people to obtain the information they need and win the influence they need to win. What this webinar is and is not, we're going to be talking about new ways to engage with your top sales targets and how to use techniques to get the information you want. We're not going to be talking about espionage or detecting deception. That's actually part of another course, or a whole new sales process. The nice thing about what we're talking about today is that everything we're discussing actually taps directly into the sales processes that you're already using. So what am I talking about there? The fact is that virtually every sales process that you adopt demands that you obtain a tremendous amount of information from your prospect. Most sales programs stipulate that you learn at least some of these sorts of things. Enough about your prospect's business model and organization so you can intuit areas where you can help them make or save money. Determining whether they have a problem that your product or service could fix. Understanding whether solving their problem is worth enough to them that they will actually pay you for that privilege, and what the priority is of that solution for them right now, what else they've tried and what competitors they're considering, who their key decision makers are and the roles they play in making that choice, their budget, and the purchasing timeline, and details about your competitors' offering in the end. Not only that, but I'm sorry, is there something somebody's trying to say? You know what? I'm going to retreat from my previous comment and I'm going to actually mute everybody. Sorry to do that to you. Mute all. Current and new participants will be muted. Okay, if you want to say something, when I ask a question, I'll come over and unmute you. How's that? We'll work it that way rather than the other way around. Okay, but then beyond those elements of information that you need to get, regardless of whether you're using the Challenger sales approach or you're using Miller-Hyman or spin sales or any sales process used by anyone else, you also need to get not just that sort of technical, positional, and role information, but you've also got to understand what's going to get people to buy. What are the triggers that are going to get them to tumble your way when confronted with a decision? Turns out, as most people who study purchasing decisions will tell you, and there's a lot of research on this that I can share if you want to reach out to me, that because buying decisions are 90% emotional, and that's based on a lot of good research, when clients build a purchasing process, it is in an effort to push back on that wave of subterranean emotion that often drives purchasing choices and also helps them justify a choice that they're going to make in the end anyway. This is very often the case. I'm sure you've seen that happen. It's not strictly rational. Okay? All right. So using conversational sales intelligence, tools that come out of the intelligence community for getting information you need about your client and what they need and want and how they feel about things, you'll get a lot of answers to questions that aren't just there for the asking. Conversational sales intelligence is actually part of something called intelligence selling, which includes also influence tools that helps you identify key leaders, capture their interest, convince them, and motivate them to act specifically to make a purchase that benefits them and, of course, will benefit you. So what happens when you go into a question and answer session? Well, it can start to feel like an interrogation, not a conversation. Turns out that interviews, which is questions and answers after all, are good at developing information, but not relationships. An interview presumes, for instance, that you share the exact same purposes in the discussion as your interlocutor, the person you're speaking with. You may not. It just may be that your prospect doesn't have the exact same goals in mind for this particular conversation that you do. So salespeople need tools that can help them get prospects to share all the information they need while still strengthening the relationship in the process. So that looks more like a conversation, not an interview. So I don't know if any of you have ever seen this. There are other ways to get information, of course. We could emulate the guy from Police Squad and do it this way, I suppose. Don't tell me it's not going to play for me now. It's not playing for me. Okay, here's what I'm going to do, folks. I am going to pull up the link. We just tested this before the event, but it didn't work. So forgive me. This is too good to skip. There it is. Okay, here we go. Let's hope you hear it this time.
Yeah. Lieutenant Drebin, Police Squad.
Oh, I remember you, Drebin. What do you want?
I want to ask you some questions. You familiar with that face?
I don't know. My memory ain't so great.
Oh, yeah? Maybe this will refresh your memory.
I don't know. It's still kind of hazy.
How about this?
Yeah, I remember him. I used to see him around. Why do you want to know?
I can't tell you that.
Well, maybe this'll help.
I really don't think I should.
Yeah, you still don't think so?
All right, his name is Nordberg. He's a cop.
He was no cop. He was dealing H.
What?
I'm telling you, he was dirty.
Oh, you sniveling scum. I ought to run you in right now.
All right. He worked at Ludwig Shipping. He tried to push something on one of my boys. I swear it. So what are you going to do about it, copper?
Well, why should I tell you?
Maybe this'll help.
I still don't think I should tell you.
Can you spot me at 20? How about now?
All right, I'm going down to Ludwig's office. I'll find out if you're telling the truth.
Okay, so, yeah, maybe we don't have enough 20s here to quite make it work. So what do you do? Well, let me ask you a question, if I may. Sorry, hit the wrong button there. Have you ever known any, I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit here. Well, apparently I'm missing a slide. My apologies. Have you ever known anyone who is highly successful, truly highly successful in getting information from people in difficult settings? And I'm going to unmute you and see if anybody can share their thoughts on this. So have you ever known anyone who seems to be able to get anybody to tell them anything? Comments? What did they do?
Conheci cara que conseguia fazer isso bem.
What was that?
Tinha bom relacionamento, assim, sabe?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear that comment. What have you noticed that people tend to do if they seem to be highly successful at getting anyone to tell them anything?
You know, what I've seen is they do a really great job of connecting emotionally and kind of getting the other person to feel like they're on the same page, you know, in terms of perspectives before launching into anything that seems purposeful in terms of gathering information.
Frank, that's a good comment. Did they do any prep for that, or did it just happen?
Well, you know, I have someone who's extraordinarily good at doing qualitative research, and often the first 5 or 10 minutes is just all about rapport building. And the guy is just down to earth, in terms of like how he puts people at ease. He asks some questions about themselves. It's like, the conversation tends to be much more about, okay, like who are you, and just builds a more comfortable and kind of emotionally safe environment before launching into anything that even looks like a question.
All right. So they spend a lot of time building the foundation before they launch into anything like an interview. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Another thing I've seen is that sometimes people who are really good at this will tell you something about themselves that makes it easier to share something about yourself.
Excellent. Those are both excellent comments. Okay, unless there's any more, I'm going to go ahead and mute you and we'll get back in line. And by the way, I apologize for a little bit of slide confusion. We made a change or two, I think inadvisedly, just before the start of the presentation. Here we go. Okay. All right, so driving on. So if the principal method of getting information that we have is simply to ask for it, we are hobbled. We don't have our full panoply of options. Besides, no matter how truthful people are, most people tend to spin answers to position themselves to look a little better. For example, think about that last job interview that you went into. Maybe during that interview, someone might have asked you, tell me about your worst day on your previous job. You probably didn't say, well, it's the day that I got up in the dark so I wouldn't wake my spouse, and got dressed in the dark and ended up wearing mismatching clothes and had to zip off to a store to buy a shirt that actually went with my pants before I showed up at the interview. No, you probably said something more like, well, it's the day that Sally and I were both tasked with a key presentation, and Sally got sick, but I was able to work through the night and we won the client. That's positioning. It's not really the worst day, but it's what you chose to share. If a prospect sees the request as too intrusive or the information is too sensitive, they're going to spin an answer or they're going to withhold one. So what do people do differently? This is the slide I was looking for. Well, Frank, you've answered part of that, but also part of what people do to get people to talk is they do a lot of careful preparation before they ask the first question. Now, this particular slide is to share another concept, though. Before I get into the preparation, I want to talk about what happens if you dive directly into asking direct questions instead of another approach. If you were all in front of me inside a classroom and I asked you this question, how's your sex life? And this is the real reason I've just muted you, because I really don't want to know. What your immediate thought typically would be, why are you asking? Why here? Why now? And what will you do with the information? The other ways to get what you want tend to be more conversational and rely less on an interrogative approach. We're going to talk a little bit on how to avoid what we call the inverse Radio Shack approach. I don't know, some of you in North America probably remember an ad campaign by the retailer Radio Shack some years ago that ran like this. You've got questions, we've got answers. Well, the inverse Radio Shack approach, and Radio Shack went out of business, and that's probably why, is I've got questions and you've got answers. It's all about me. I know that you want me to help you. I'm going to ask you a lot of questions and you're just simply going to tell me the truth. It doesn't really work that way. What I'll tell you is the techniques we're about to share with you, we can't share them all. We've only got 45 minutes, not our 2-day training span, is these techniques are so effective that at the end of training, typically, and I can promise you that if you even use these techniques, you'll see a difference. But at the end of training, we typically go to a shopping mall and get complete strangers to tell class participants such things as how much they make, and if they're shop owners, the most expensive item in their shop that gives them the best margin, and how much they pay for their overhead, for their rent on their shop. That's really astonishing. When we used to train this to people in the national security realm, we would enter a shopping mall and total strangers would say such things as where they bank, the range of money that was available in their account at any one time, and their PIN. No kidding. Out of any class of 25 people, we would get 4 or 5 that would say that. This stuff really does work. So why do people talk? People talk for a variety of reasons. They talk to be noticed, for sympathy or companionship, to correct error, just to make fix a statement that you made that wasn't quite right, to gossip, to build common cause, or just to help you. Here are 7 simple steps that will help you ensure that you get the information you need from prospects and customers in a way that makes them comfortable and builds the relationship without using deception or any sort of ruse ploy. First, and we're going to go through each of these in turn, you prepare in advance. Use the principles of FRED. FRED's an acronym we're going to describe in a couple of minutes. Network into your target. Don't go directly to your key target right away until you've gathered enough information about them, and the clue is that that has to do with that acronym FRED, so that you can understand them deeply enough to be sure to hit their hot buttons. And there's a framework that we call using I Wonder. Focus on them, follow a pattern called the conversational hourglass, invert the role of questions and statements, don't drill down when you get good information, and debrief quickly. Now we're going to share these slides with you. So if you send me a note, I'll share my email address with you. Send me a note afterwards, and I'll be glad to share these slides. So you don't worry about not getting this information all written down. Getting ready. Of course, if you're a good salesperson, you always look at the company you're targeting and what they might need before you ever show up. You know what the latest news is. You know what changes have been made in their top echelon of their leadership. You know whether their purchasing manager is new to the job or old at the job, where they came from, what companies they came from, and maybe even know something about them. But typically, most salespeople of my acquaintance spend a lot more time on their target's business than on their target's representatives. That's fine, but you need more. What do you know about them? What are they like, and what do they like? If you don't know what their company needs, they don't have an excuse to talk to you. And if you don't have a clue who they are, they don't want to talk to you, typically. So what do we mean when we talk about networking into someone? And why is the advanced research important? As it happens, I've gone to 2 different schools. Actually, I've gone to one school. No, I've gone to both schools. I'm sorry. I graduated from one. The other one I just attended, which both have extensive networks. One is a university on the East Coast called Johns Hopkins, and the other is a university here in Utah called Brigham Young University. Most university alumni organizations are fairly robust in most countries. Having common frames of reference, such as common acquaintances or schools, such as you might discover in LinkedIn or Facebook, give you good reasons to connect with people who might know the person that you need to target. So for example, if this is you and this is the person you want to target, you might discover that there's one or more individuals that you actually connect with who know that individual and can tell you a little bit about them. Of course, if you call up an acquaintance or even someone that you share a school connection with and start interrogating them about somebody else, that's not going to go very well. We're going to talk a little bit about how this works in a minute, but the basic concept is if you understand a little bit about your target and not only what their interests are, but who they know, and if you can establish a common connection and get referred into them, and maybe talk to that common connection about your target before you make your first touch, you're going to do a lot better in that conversation. We'll explain more in just a moment. I talked about using FRED. Well, who is FRED? Well, this isn't really FRED. FRED is an acronym. This stands for facts, relationships, employment and background, and desires. FRED reveals what individuals might know. For example, they might, or what authority they have, in fact. They might have purchasing authority, or they might know who does, or they might know about a company's real needs or their procurement criteria. The relationships that a particular target has, which are critically important, where they come from and where they have worked and what they may want. So let's talk a little bit more about that. As you're doing this research, by the way, this is just a note that says you should definitely write everything up as you're going along, what you learn about people, so that you're making a plan to go forward. Here's how we use FRED. Let's say, once again, this is the person you're going after. Let's say that you want to understand a little bit more about this person's core interests and whether or not they are friendly and approachable, and how they deal with salespeople. Well, in order to get to your target person, if you discover, for instance, and I'll use myself as an example, if I do a little bit of research on LinkedIn within a particular target company, and I find out that one of those people that works for that company graduated from one of those schools that I've attended, I might be able to say something like, "Hello, Jack. This is Kent. You don't know me, but I noticed we went on LinkedIn that we went to the same school, and I wonder if you could point me to the right person for this particular sort of decision. Maybe it's a buying decision, or it's a little bit of information that I need." Now, the fact that we share a common background of any sort might incline him or her to speak to me, or it might not, but at least I'm not starting flat-footed in a sort of a cold way. If I can establish that I know somebody else that this person also knows, that gives me another opportunity to say, you know, I noticed that we both know Jill over here, not wearing a skirt today, as you can see, she's in a pantsuit. But I thought I would start with you and see if you could tell me a little bit more about who I should talk to on a particular subject. Jack then may or may not mention my target, but that gives me a point in that gives me a chance in the conversation to say something like, "I wonder if so-and-so would be the right person." He'd say, "Well, no, it's actually this person over here," or "Yes, it is." This is where the words "I wonder" become particularly important. I wonder if, I wonder how, I wonder who. We call them magic words because you're not asking a direct question, which cognitive psychologists tell us shut conversations down or cause people to spin things when you're on sensitive grounds, but you're sort of pondering and ruminating on it yourself and giving the other person a chance to respond. The next thing to remember as you do this is, this is of course a line from a recent movie, Doctor Strange, in which the Ancient One tells him that he's too focused on himself. It's not about you. So often when we go into an interview with a prospect, we are so focused on what we need out of it that we're failing to focus adequately on them. What we're really talking about is, back in the process of networking to our target, we do a little bit of research on each of these targets that we touch in turn before we get to our target of choice, in order to learn just enough about them so that the conversation with them is interesting and useful, if at all possible, and that they feel very glad to refer you to the person you wish to speak to. That way, when you talk to Sam, if that's the decision maker here, you can say that you've spoken to Jack, possibly to Jill, and you don't know, again, use the humble approach, whether they're the right person, but you were wondering if, or wondering how they might be able to help you, or wondering who you should talk to if it's not them. Again, that's the magic of this. You're not focused on yourself, you're focused on them, and your approach is humble. It's simply not about you. Here's the next point, and this comes straight out of the intelligence community, and it's very useful. The conversational hourglass takes into account the fact that I stated a minute ago. The cognitive psychologists tell us that what most people remember about conversations are the beginning of conversations, the end of conversations, and any questions that are asked. So the trick is to avoid asking questions when you're on sensitive ground. So when we're finding out about how much a person makes in a store, for example, if obviously that's not a real business question, but as an exercise in some of this training, you don't walk right up and say, hey, how much do you make? What you might do is start the conversation in another way and then have a conversation that gets onto the topic of compensation and then make a few statements. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But the general idea is that you start by building rapport, shift to the topic of choice, talk about that topic more specifically using statements. We'll talk about that. Shift away from the topic and then exit out into general conversation. This isn't a single direct linear line as you see here. You might go in and out of sensitive subjects throughout your conversation. The next thing, and this is key, is throughout the use of this hourglass, you make sure that you convert all your questions, your most sensitive questions, into statements. Let me just pause to say here, of course, if you can get someone to sit down and permit you to pummel them with a series of targeted questions, that's the most efficient way to get the information that you need. We're talking here about the really sensitive things, like budget and timeline and concerns and real needs and wants that they harbor in their heart of hearts. What do I mean by inverting the role of questions and statements? Typically, in a conversation, you use questions to get information and statements for conversational flow. So I'm going to give you an example of this, if I may. Frank, I'm going to pick on you, if that's okay. I'm going to unmute everybody. Are you still there, Frank?
I sure am.
So Frank, now Frank and I have not rehearsed this, I've got to tell you. Okay? And Frank, you could blow
Who
me
are you again?
Yeah, right. I recognize you could blow me out of the water if you do this wrong, but I'm gonna take my luck. You know, Frank, let's pretend that you and I are just in a dinner or something, and there's not a lot of people listening in. You know, Frank, it's really interesting to me living in a larger city as I did when I lived in Atlanta, because I really grew up in a small town.
Yep. Yeah.
So say something, Frank.
Oh yeah, no, I grew up in upstate New York, probably a smaller town than just about anyone on the call.
So probably one of those places where they roll up the main street at night, right?
There was no main street. Actually, there was nothing. It was like 500 people.
Wow, right up on the Canadian border.
No, it was like in the northern Mohawk Valley, lower Adirondacks, just a small mountain area. No post office, it was basically an intersection and a cluster of homes.
Oh my goodness.
Surrounded area, so.
Now, notice Frank hasn't actually told me the name of the town, but he's pretty well positioned it. Okay? Yeah. And if I left the subject at this point and went on into other areas, we'd be able to come back and Frank could probably tell me the name of the town, or I could ask him outright, because he's broached it pretty thoroughly, haven't you, Frank?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I would definitely tell you, it's Ephrata.
Ephrata. I've never even heard of Ephrata. You're right.
I'm afraid to tell you.
So how did I start, though? I didn't start by asking him a question. I made a statement about myself, about my own experience, correct?
Yes.
And that made you feel comfortable about talking a little bit about yourself and your background. Okay?
Yes. That was very, very clever.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more. Here's some more examples. First off, remember, it's not about you. Make statements, let them correct you. It's okay to be naive if you are. I mean, if you're pretending that you lack information on nuclear science and you have a PhD in nuclear physics, no one's going to believe you. or you're not going to be credible for very long. But the concept here is that if you've done the research in advance and you quote some of the things that you've heard recently about the company, or you say, well, that was interesting where your company did X or Y, and you want more information about X or Y, they're very likely to correct what you thought you had heard and fill you in more. Also, since you've done the research in advance, you know something about what they want, or you can guess something about what might interest them in any conversation. Give to get. I gave to you, Frank, a little bit of information about where I grew up. I didn't really say where, I just said it was a small town, okay? And you gave back. Also, indirect references often work very well. Most of you have had the privilege of working for more than one employer, if you consider that a privilege. I do. And of working in more than one industry or in different aspects of the same industry. An indirect reference can often get people to talk about a similar topic in their organization. So for example, Frank, I'm going to continue to pick on you because those of you who are listening can probably tell now, I actually happen to know Frank. Actually, I'm going to pick on Craig. Craig, are you still here?
I am.
Okay, Craig. Craig is the CEO of a technology company on the West Coast. So, Craig, let's say that you happen to work for a big power generation company, okay? And you're responsible for the procurement of turbines to replace worn out equipment in your system. Is that have I given you a good job?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. It's a demotion from where you are, I'm afraid, but there it is. Okay. Now, if we were in somewhat casual conversation and we were talking about the procurement of big equipment, I might talk to you a little bit about an experience I had with a large generator of, I used nuclear a few minutes ago, of nuclear power, Areva, okay? And I might talk just a little bit about some of the difficulties they had and see if my focus of interest was finding out what kind of warranty you were looking for on your equipment, but I didn't want you to tell me straight out, Craig, because that could be almost a negotiating position that then a threshold I then have to cross, right? But I want to find out your views on warranties. And I started talking about some of the warranties that Areva gave or didn't give and the problems that gave some of their clients in the nuclear space, okay, on some of their larger pieces of equipment. Would you in turn feel inclined to talk a little bit about warranties?
Right. Yeah. No, that's a great way because you would naturally start talking about my experiences with warranties or you know what I've seen work as well, because I'd be compare and contrast with that. So.
And what would be different in terms of our experience and the information I might get than if I said if I did that conversationally rather than saying directly to you, Craig, tell me what is the warranty you expect on your equipment?
Well, right. I think it's an interesting aspect because what I may have some formal requirements or even informal requirements that the company expects to see. But I have my own experience and my own expectations with respect to what has worked, and that helps kind of convey that. So I might, in a situation, I could see if it brought around properly, I could be an advocate for you in a warranty situation over what might be normal with my company if it was something I thought was unnecessary.
Right, because what's happening is we're getting into a discussion about warranties kind of obliquely from the side. We're not going at it head on, and you're not laying out the hurdles I now need to leap as a vendor, correct? We both know that we're going to be discussing warranties, but if we're having just general conversation, and I've been talking to you about some of my experience in power generation, and when I said Craig, by the way, works for a technical firm, his company is deep into power generation. And I knew that you had an interest in some of these areas, and I talked about my experience and some things that I'd experienced, and Craig, you shared back, I'm learning not only what your thresholds are, but I'm learning what your personal interests and concerns are. And it would be easy for me to cite back to that conversation later on when we want to have a direct conversation about what your requirements are in terms of a warranty on your equipment, correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Now, here's a key point, folks. Once you get a little bit of information, remember we're going through the hourglass, then you flare back out. If you remember the hourglass, the bottom part of the hourglass is you shift to other conversational elements and then continue the conversation in other ways. Don't stay on a sensitive topic for long. That's a little bit like the dentist, failing to give you sufficient Novocaine and drilling in when it really hurts. If you ever watch someone, when you start asking sensitive questions and you can kind of tell that you have because their eyebrows go up and maybe they step back a little bit and you stay on the subject, you have just cemented in their mind the fact that you are not that concerned about them and that perhaps they need to be more careful with you in the future. That's the last thing that you want. Don't drill down. Touch on the subject, get a little bit of information, find out a little bit about that warranty, find out about what town Frank came from, and then go on to something else. Come back later for more information from another angle. You're going to get more information faster than if you just drill in, believe me. Now here's the last main point. Debrief and write it up. This includes the Fred information. Now this is just an example. This is actually something we use in trade shows after we've had a contact. Everything on the left is kind of traditional. It's about who you talk to, when, information about your contact when you met them, what their value is to you, what's the opportunity. Fred is on the right. Facts, relationships, education, background, desires. What do they want? How can you need them? This is the more sensitive stuff that details about what makes them tick and what their personal hot buttons are. Be sure to write down also relationships, who they know that they can introduce you to, and how they can help you in this situation, and their warmth and helpfulness and next steps. Now, basically, we've gone through this 2 days of training in 1 day, and we've missed a lot. So what we haven't done is we haven't gone through nonverbal communications and reading body language as it's taught to national intelligence and a lot of business professionals. We've trained about, well, we're not sure, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people in this process. We also haven't talked about detecting deception. As it turns out, the human being is an instrument of truth. This is why polygraphs work. Have you ever noticed that when you stole cookies as a kid, your mom could get that out of you without a lot of difficulty? And by the way, if you say no, they couldn't get it out of me, I'm worried about you. Because when you're a little boy or a little girl, this kind of information is hard to keep from mom. No, she doesn't have eyes in the back of her head. She just knows your body language inside and out. And that shiftiness of foot and eye tells her something about where you've been. Maybe the crumbs on your lips also told her something. But detecting deception is critical if you're going to be talking to people about budgets, criteria, decision criteria, and timelines. If you can't read their body language and their verbal and nonverbal communication to determine when they are distancing themselves from a decision, you're not going to be able to know whether they're telling you the whole truth, and you won't be able to dig in to get the right information. We're not talking about trade show intelligence except peripherally, or how to use this information you're getting to directly sway people to make decisions you want. As a friend of mine, John Nolan, once said, when he was in the business in national security of recruiting people to actually commit espionage on behalf of Western allies, his comment is, you have to do something special if you're going to convince people to betray their own country for $100 a month in the undying love of the American people. Well, we're not going to teach you how to do anything so sneaky as that. But the whole concept of how to get people to align with you has been tried and proven in a whole field called PSYOPs, psychological operations. This is PSYOPs for civilians. It works. Decision culture analysis is x-raying companies to identify and sway decision makers. And then there's a number of statements that fit into this matrix of how you get people to tell you stuff that's sensitive. Now we have a little note we want to make here, and that is at the beginning of any class, and we'd like to ask you to use this here as well, these techniques work well enough, they really do, that we actually have people sign up to a pledge, and that is that they won't use these tools in a nefarious way. I promise you they work. They can work for good or for evil. We advocate using them for good and never lying, always win-win or win-neutral, never win-lose in conversations, and you'll have success. The results are tidal waves of information without deception, unreserved conversations, strong relationships, and a foundation that you can build on for unbeatable influence. Well, that's it. We're at the end of our time. I'd like to stay on for a few minutes and take any questions that anybody has. Any questions or comments? Oh, I haven't given you my email. If you want to send me an email and get the slide information, it's Kent, K-E-N-T, at Bennion Group, B as in boy, ENNIONGROUP.com, or you can just look me up on LinkedIn and send me a message, either one. Any questions? I know I'm not that good. Anybody have any questions, comments? Okay then, thank you for joining us today, and I hope these tools are useful. Let me know as you use them how it went. We'd love to hear more.